Today, in Dialogues Without Frontier, we have the honor to receive Professor Greg Wolfe of the St Andrews University in Scotland. You are welcome, Professor.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here.
Professor Greg Wolfe is here at Unicamp thanks to a program of the Vice Presidency for Research, bringing visiting fellows to stay for a while, teaching, lecturing here, interacting with our local staff, students, graduate students, and even interested people in general. So Professor Wolfe is here to have a lecture. He is lecturing here and also interacting with the staff, and he has given us the opportunity today to talk about his main subject of research, that is the Roman Empire. The first issue, I think, is what's the relevance of studying the Roman Empire in the 21st century?
I think there's two reasons to study it. Imperialism hasn't gone away more generally, and the more we understand about imperialism in general, the more we understand about the kind of power dynamics in the world today. The other reason is that it's part of our common heritage, and it's a past which is constantly invoked by the buildings we work among, by politicians' speeches, by our literature. And so if it's going to be out there anyway, we need to be critically engaged with it.
You referred to in your reply to imperialism, to Roman imperialism, to imperialism in general. And do you think that there are some uses of the Roman imperialism in modern times, and particularly nowadays as a kind of imperial strategy in the Middle East or in other regions of the globe?
People often invoke imperialism, and since the Second World War it's mostly been invoked as a negative term, as a way of criticising people, both in Cold War contexts and in the context of decolonisation. It's occasionally invoked in a different way, and it's quite interesting to see the neocon theorists beginning to talk about good imperialism and bad imperialism only last year. And so yes, I think it is an idea that still floats about, and to some extent what value we collectively give to imperialism is going to depend on the work of scholars who've understood other imperialisms in the past.
In the case of modern imperialism, and I think nowadays, as you refer to the Americans, because we refer to the neocon in the United States, using this kind of positive or negative imperialism. And this also has to do with identities, local identities. And in the Roman world, we had a lot of different identities inside the empire. So when we live now today in this kind of also very mixed situation with local identities, so that this parallel with the Roman world, is it useful, or what could you say about it?
I think it's useful so long as we remember the differences as well. And some of the huge connections made in the world today that we think about in terms of globalization aren't made by states or empires, and the United States and Europe and the Soviet Union are not empires in the same sense as the empires that existed before the Industrial and French Revolutions. But there are some similarities, and when these huge connections are made between different parts of the world, you do end up with some areas becoming more marginalized relative to the center of power, and with identities changing in those contexts. I think there are some very definite parallels between ancient globalizations and modern globalizations. One of the big differences is ancient globalizations are generally achieved by political force, whereas modern globalizations, of course, it's also to do with capital.
And well, then you refer to the use of force in antiquity, the army, while nowadays you have also marked forces. But then again, another issue related to this would be, let's say, soft power, in the sense that today there is a strong link of imperialism with the spreading of ideas through soft means, while the Romans, for example, used the army directly. So in this catalog of differences, as you were referring to, do you think that it's relevant to compare, even by opposition, the situation the Romans faced in different provinces with so-called modern empires?
Yeah, all comparisons evoke contrast, like all contrasts evoke comparison, and the two methods go together. So I don't think there's a problem there. Soft power. Well, Romans, we think about Romans in terms of force, armies, gladiators, and so on. But when one thinks about an empire that maybe had between 55 and 100 million people and had an army of under 500,000, we realise that in ancient terms it's actually a rather limited use of force. There would be no possible way that Roman armies could physically overcome their subjects. And so issues like the use of images, ceremonial, dividing up empires into different parts, splitting the interests, making alliances between the centre of power and particular groups within subjugated nations, whether they're elites or traders or whatever, that's all part of ancient imperialism as well. So I think there's ancient soft power as well as modern soft power.
Yeah, well, I think this is very interesting because some modern historians stress the differences between our own age with this stress on soft power and convincement of people that they are belong to a state, to a nation state, while apparently the Romans were not that much concerned with the kind of belonging sentiments by the subjects. But still, as you mentioned, the army was not so powerful. So there was some kind of cultural aspects that would be important also in the Roman world.
Yes, it's not really a culture politique. It's not as if they have a particular program, but Romans did recognise the value of people in the provinces who had come to share their values. And the famous quotation of Tacitus talking about the Roman governor Agricola in Britain, arguing that the subject Britons had been taught to build cities for themselves and bath houses, and they thought that they were becoming civilized, but actually, says Tacitus, they were taking on slavery, servitude. So I think Romans were aware of those dimensions of their power as well.
Yeah, well, in a way, it could be easily compared with modern McDonald's or whatever, that are also, or Hollywood, or so this kind of soft approach in modern
maybe today there's less coordination between the two kinds of power, that it's not very obvious that military policy makers in the West have very much influence over McDonald's or over Starbucks. Maybe the reverse is true. And I think, although we sometimes talk about it, the West as a single entity, we've got a series of different entities. We've got image-producing entities, we've got commercial entities, got financial entities, and as we've seen dramatically in the last few years, the interest of financial entities are not necessarily the same as the interest of states. Whereas in antiquity, you don't have so many alternatives. It all centres around the emperor and the court and the city of Rome and the ceremonies. And there isn't a separate financial sector, there isn't a separate cultural establishment. It'd be impossible to have the kind of fragmentation of power you have today.
Yeah. Well, we could then turn to the subject of the relevance of this, the study of the past in general, and particularly of the Romans, in the modern context. And the first issue would be in Britain. What's your stand about the scholarly relevance of the humanities, and specifically of the study of the Roman world, in the context of the British academia?
The British academia is under current pressure from British government to justify its worth in terms of the benefits it produces to the public, and that's exactly right. Publicly funded research should speak to the interest of the public. The question is, how do you define interest? And if you define interest only in terms of short-term economic value, then it's quite difficult for many humanities subjects to show why producing another great book on Voltaire or Jane Austen is going to suddenly invigorate some area of the country's economy. It's not going to happen. But there's a very clear public interest in having a critical establishment, in having people who are sufficiently educated to subject the kind of statements that they read and hear to a critical engagement. And for that you do need to train people to think in the way that humanities do train you to think. So I suspect it's more in the interest of the public than of the state to have an educated public, and what the humanities does is educates, and it encourages us to engage in our own education.
It's a kind of philosophical use of history or of the past, so that we can be more learned people.
I think it's not something that's simply a sort of Enlightenment aspiration. I think if you look at states today which have not made it possible for their people to think about the past in a detached and objective way, then you look at states which have huge difficulties. It's actually terribly important for democracy to have a group of people who vote who think, I'm not necessarily going to believe that thing that I read or I heard. I'm not going to necessarily accept that received wisdom. So I think democracy does need to have critical individuals within it.
Yeah, it's a good defense of the subject. But then I would ask you something even more specific, but it's of general interest too, in relation to Latin language, specifically our Greek language, that so-called dead languages that are in decline, considering what they were used in the grammar school in the 19th century, early 20th century, up to recently, let's say, the last 4 decades or so. So this decline of general study of the classical languages, is it relevant? Should we fight to change this, or what are your stand about this, the general public relationship with dead languages?
I think studying dead languages can be fun and interesting, but it's only one of a number of subjects that's fun and interesting. It's not better in itself than studying ecology or economics or human physiology or psychology. They're all good subjects, and the academy needs all of them. I like to think of a parallel with my colleagues who work in astronomy departments, and quite often encourage lots of students to come to courses which, whether they're really called this or not, are often described as astronomy for poets. And a kind of astronomy that tells you the names of the planets and the stars and talks a bit about how the solar system works. And it's an enormously valuable kind of exercise you can have, but it's one that can really only be done if a small number of people understand higher math. And without higher math, you can't do proper astronomy. And the same thing goes for the study of the past. You can't study any past without being able to study sources in the original. And that means being able to study text in the original language. It means being able to study material culture using the best geophysical and scientific techniques available. We don't need to have everybody in the world being able to do carbon dating in order to understand and appreciate Stonehenge or early human origins. And you don't need everybody in the world to be able to read classical Greek in order to think about the Greek and Roman past. But it's very important some people can.
Yeah, sure. But then there is a recent tradition in several countries detaching or splitting the field of classical languages and history and archaeology, so that several archaeologists have no knowledge at all about the languages of the people they study. What's your, considering that the main thrust for this movement is the idea that you must use only anthropological data and analogies. Yeah. What's your think about that?
I think that sort of very extreme reaction has to some extent diminished now. That it was certainly true when I was a student that archaeologists, some of them, were thinking that they could operate in a completely text-free world, even when the people they studied had used texts. And there were equally historians who regarded material culture as something that you only really use when the texts run out. But I don't think people seriously use that anymore.
That's good news.
Of course, ideally every archaeologist would be able to read Latin and Greek and be able to do their own radiocarbon dating. I can't do radiocarbon dating. I can read Latin and Greek.
Yeah, and then again, there is also the problem that we are referring to Greek and Latin, but there are also minority languages even in antiquity. Could we think of Aramaic,
Syriac,
Hebrew,
yes.
or Syriac, or
hardly anybody can read Demotic Egyptian, and yet there's huge numbers of papyrus never ever been translated or read. Whereas most Greek and Latin texts have been read and translated.
Several times.
Several is an underestimate.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much for accepting to come to Brazil and to come to the show.
Well, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
And it has been a pleasure to receive today Professor Greg Wolf.